This week marks exactly a year since the Gauteng Health Department's Covid-19 PPE procurement scandal broke out. Heads have rolled, including that of former MEC for Dr. Bandile Masuku, as Premier David Makhura claimed the high ground as a prominent of a clean and transparent government. Makhura has repeatedly promised clean finances, lifestyle audits and intolerance to officials implicated in corruption. Now, one of the initiatives his administration introduced was the Covid-19 Expenditure Disclosure reports published monthly by the Gauteng Treasury on the province's website. To discuss this and more, we're joined by Citizen Maverick Editor Mark Heywood, Daily Maverick Editor Mark Heywood, to give us more there. Mark, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. A really significant time to mark on the calendar, because this week already marks a year since the chaos and that information broke out on PPEs. The big scandal which really triggered a lot more than what we expected.
Good morning. Yes, almost exactly a year. July 2020, that the first media reports came out about PPE-related corruption, linking the names of Kusela Diko, Bandile Masuku, other people in the Gauteng Health Department, and which I think, the country was scandalized that in the midst of a crisis where people were losing their lives, where healthcare workers were on the front lines, that monies that were meant to be going to protect lives and to protect healthcare workers could be abused in this way. And the scandal was so great that it forced the national government and provincial governments to introduce measures to try to, or at least ostensibly, to try to create greater transparency about finances and to reassure public that politicians were actually committed to anti-corruption measures. I think, the sad thing is that a year later, as we look back, we see that corruption wasn't just limited to the health department in Gauteng. It infected the education department. It infected the Department of Infrastructure Development. It's also infected Johannesburg Metropolitan Council. And yet there are less than a handful of heads that have rolled, people who've lost their positions. Nobody's in prison as a result, literally, of the theft of probably over R1 billion.
Nobody's in prison, and those who should essentially be in prison are willing to give it their all to ensure that they stay out of prison and also keep their political careers.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think what the irony is that the proceeds of crime, the riches that people have got through dodgy tenders, are often then used to pay for expensive lawyers to keep people, to keep the courts busy and to keep people out of prison. Just this week, for example, there was a case judged by the Competition Tribunal where the people allegedly involved in corruption in sanitizing schools in Gauteng tried to get the courts to lift the assets freezing of those companies. Thankfully, it was not successful. So we've got a long way to go with this battle. But as you said in our introduction, what concerns us is not just that things are going slowly, but that things are going backwards. So in the wake of the PPE scandal, Gauteng and other provinces introduced these what are known as Covid-19 Expenditure Disclosure reports, where they published monthly every single tender, every single transaction, what the amount was, who was the recipient of that amount. And we had those reports, and they were incredibly helpful. They lasted between April and January of this year, but Gauteng has now ceased to publish those reports. There has been no report since January of 2021, and there's no good reason given as to why those reports are not being published any longer.
Those reports came with a lot of benefits for journalists and those who really wanted to get down to the truth and uncover the matter as it was. And the matter of transparency, of course, you make mention of one of the exposés, that school sanitization program of along 400 million rand there being something that was uncovered because of those reports, and of course the so-called fogging and fumigation report, which exposed and spoke to a lot more money, over 100 million rand also being misused in that report. So I suppose on one aspect there could be some good reason as to why those reports are not as readily available as they were after discovering the explosive information that was found from those reports.
Well, I think that's a cynical but sad and probably truthful interpretation as to why these reports are not being published, because what they did was allow everybody in this country to see who was getting paid and for what, and it allowed us to join the dots and to raise questions. You know, what normally happens is that wasteful, irregular and corrupt expenditure only gets picked up by the Auditor General much later, when the Auditor General goes through the departmental reports. By that point, the horse has bolted frequently, and there's very, very little consequence when the Auditor General picks up the wrongful expenditure of literally hundreds of millions of rands. So these allowed us, I picked it up through my own investigations, live at the very moment almost that those payments were being made, to raise questions about them. And Paul, let's be clear, this is not small sums of money. Gauteng Education Department, 431 million rand spent on sanitizing schools, against the advice of the Health Department that such sanitizing was not necessary. Gauteng Department of Infrastructure Development, 117 million rand on defogging. And you know what's tragic is that next week in the Limpopo High Court, Section 27 will go back in the Michael Kamapi case. Remember the little boy who drowned at the bottom of a toilet, to deal with arguments by the Limpopo Education Department that it does not have money to eradicate pit toilets in schools, that it doesn't have a few millions of rands needed to put in place safe and clean and sanitary toilets. And yet we have this vast amount of money that is squandered and stolen. That's really what the consequence of these failures is.
With those consequences that you're speaking of, you've also warned in your article that Johannesburg may be another scandal in the making. What do you mean when you speak of Johannesburg being a city to watch very closely when it comes to what more we could uncover?
Well, and Paul, before I come to Johannesburg, because it's linked to Johannesburg, what I would say is that I think that this so-called defogging, sanitizing, has been as much of a cash cow as PPE was at the beginning. And I think that if we were to look in all provinces across the country, we will probably find that large amounts of money have been spent on so-called decontamination, defogging, chemical defogging, that was completely unnecessary. It is not recommended by the Health Department, it's not recommended by the World Health Organization, and yet it continues to this day, when in fact, offices, schools, hospitals can be cleaned using ordinary detergents and materials and made safe from COVID-19. So there's a bigger issue here that journalists haven't actually uncovered seriously yet, but which I can bet my bottom dollar, as they say, that if people looked, you would find that there is corruption here. Now, with Johannesburg, I'm told, has spent up to 400 million rand, also on decontamination and defogging. Largely unnecessary expenditure. It still needs further investigation. I was approached last week with information to look into about this. So again, I think that, I don't want to pronounce on it at this moment in time, but it's indicative of a pervasive problem of misuse of funds around COVID-19.
Misuse of funds around COVID-19, you speak of exorbitant amounts of money, really just highlighting the impact of corruption and, of course, corruption at an unprecedented time where there are so many questions and not many answers. And one of the big questions, of course, is the attention being paid now to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who has to really play a strategic game of chess when it comes to acting to some of this massive corruption and the impact of the corruption on citizens and the expose by the SIU, which really places the spotlight on President Cyril Ramaphosa. What are your thoughts around that when it comes to talk of a cabinet reshuffle and honing in on those responsible for corruption?
Well, it shouldn't be a strategic game of chess. It should be a simple question of, is there right or is there wrong? Where there is wrong, where there is evidence of corruption, prima facie evidence of corruption, it needs to be investigated. There need to be sufficient resources to make sure that those alleged to be involved in corruption can't play the courts and play the law for years and years in order to escape criminal justice. President Ramaphosa needs to find the funds that are needed to make our courts work more efficiently, that are needed to make it possible for the NPA to work more efficiently, to cover more ground, the SIU to cover more ground. You know, all of these institutions, and Paul, are straining under the volume of our expectations. The SIU can't hope to deal with the number of cases that are brought to its door. For example, this week, I wrote and sent questions to the SIU concerning Gauteng. One of the questions I asked was whether they were investigating what I uncovered regarding the 117 million rand defogging by the Gauteng Infrastructure Department. And they said, no, they're not. So you know, you have prima facie a blatant abuse that people are still getting away with as we talk. And what President Ramaphosa needs to understand, and the country needs to understand, is that if we invest in our investigative, in our prosecutorial services, the money will be recompensed many times over. It will create a new culture where you don't get away with corruption, but we will be able to recoup some of that money. So like I say, I think what we're all fed up of is the very notion that this is a game of chess, that you can't tackle this particular politician or that particular politician because it may have a destabilizing effect in the factional lineups within the African National Congress. That's the wrong way to go. There's right and there's wrong. There's justice and there's injustice. And corruption, the people who are paying from corruption are the people who are suffering the most at this moment from COVID-19 and our responses to try to contain it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insight and weighing in there. Maverick Editor Mark Heywood speaking to Gauteng government change of heart when it comes to financial transparency and releasing those very important reports that led to massive exposés of corruption that was uncovered, amounting to multi-millions of rands.